Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale. Narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 4. Shut Down for the Night. In the blink of an eye, Sophie was transported to the corridor in scope. Although the world still knew it as Shadow, where the playground door could be found, it was where she always met Yasmin and Clara when she could be bothered, before training. A million other possible scenarios had run through her mind about what they might train on tonight since she'd made the fleeting decision to battle orcs. Flying Pegasus into battle with Chimera, sailing a ship into the mouth of the Kraken, answering the riddles of the Sphinx correctly. Out of all the possible ones available to her, Sophie's favourite was still the Minotaur. That first time when Clara threw both her and Yasmin into that maze, nothing could match that feeling. Nothing else in a training programme anyway. After pondering it for a few more moments, Sophie decided that she now definitely didn't want to fight an orc like she'd told Lizzie. She was going to do battle with Hydra, the many-headed water monster from Greek mythology. 200 feet tall and with at least 6 dragon heads, all of which would be out to snap her in half. Sophie was tingling at the idea of going to war with it. She racked her brains for what Miss Sissons or her dad had told her about it, and realised that there were a few things she simply had to remember to defeat it. The sword of fire, she said to herself, as her anticipation grew, and wrap a cloth around my face to protect me from the poisonous gas. Many other things flashed through her mind, but those were the main two that she knew she had to remember. Sophie felt that with her dad's stories, Miss Sissons' teaching, and her own reading, she would know what to do against any creature on earth. Sophie reached forward and started to try and type on the keypad that was located at head height, for an adult, to the left of the door. No lights came on like they normally did. Baffled, she tried again, but still no lights. After a third attempt, Sophie stepped back from the keypad and kicked the door in frustration. Why wasn't it working? It had never broken before. Annoyed, she typed out a message to Miss Sissons and Yasmin. Why isn't the playground letting me go in? Almost instantaneously, a message came back from Yasmin. Sorry, Soph. Come up to the control room. Miss Sissons wants to talk to us. Sophie tutted and zoned into the control room. It was the room where they found Miss Sissons clinging onto the levers for dear life when Katie had broken into Zatvor and was trying to release everything. Computer screens lined the walls, but there was nothing on them. The room was spread over 4 levels, and each one was more of a huge platform than a floor. Miss Sissons and Yasmin were on the top one, which also played host to the chairs and meeting area that the agents of Shadow must have used in those years gone by. Sophie imagined what it must have been like when Shadow agents were aplenty and villainous mythicals roamed the earth. It must have been a hive of activity, tracking all sorts of creatures on the screens and messages being passed to and fro between agents. What a sight it must have been. For now, though, it was deathly silent. A shadow, Sophie laughed to herself at the clever wordplay, of what it used to be. Making her way up the stairs, Sophie wondered why she didn't just zone in at the top, but she seemed to enjoy the walk. She found Miss Sissons, Yasmin, and to her surprise, Clara, all sat around talking. No screens were on, it was just the 3 of them. Hi, Soph, Miss Sissons said, with a smile on her face. Hey, Sophie, Yasmin chimed in. Clara didn't say anything. She just turned to acknowledge Sophie and smiled a rather forced smile at her. Why aren't we training? Sophie asked, rather than say hello to everyone. It wasn't that she was annoyed at not being able to train. She was more aggrieved than anything else that after a monotonous day at school, she would have this taken away from her. Night off, Soph, Miss Sissons replied. You've done nothing but train for 6 weeks straight, and that's not counting the amount of time you've used the time dilators to make it longer. Crikey, you'll be turning 16 in brain years soon if you don't slow down. But I enjoy, Sophie began to appeal. Not tonight, Sophie, Miss Sissons said more firmly, and Sophie knew not to argue back when she used that tone in her full name. Reluctantly, and seeing that her argument wasn't going to hold, Sophie pulled up a chair and joined the conversation. I got the final batch of internet implants sent out to the secondary schools today, so I thought we all deserved a night off. Not long until we'll be preparing for next year's batch, Miss Sissons said, pouring herself a drink. How are you drinking? Asked Yasmin. Are you here? Not just zoned in? Sort of. I've made a few alterations. Sophie was already bamboozled by this response, but Miss Sissons continued before Sophie could think about it any more. I've been half living here for the past 6 weeks, trying to make out like it's business as usual. For all his faults, Mr. King had all the necessary automatic protocols in place. Things get shipped automatically and delivered to schools automatically. All I had to do was keep the system up to date with who's who and fix any problems. So you haven't had too much to do? Yasmin asked wryly. No, I suppose not, Miss Sisson said. I've been testing an implant add-on that isn't quite ready for your use though. I was quite literally beside myself when I first got it to work. Sophie pondered that last sentence for a moment. The word literally had got her wondering exactly what Miss Sissons was up to. What have you three been up to? I know about you, Clara. Miss Sissons proceeded to ask, clearly trying to take the focus of the conversation away from herself. Clara shook her head and looked at her with dread like she was going to spill some secret that she had, but Miss Sissons carried on regardless. But what about you two? She asked Sophie and Yasmin. Clara seemed to sigh with relief. I got on the school council, Yasmin said excitedly. Hey, well done, Yas. Made any big decisions yet? Miss Sissons seemed remarkably impressed. The governors came in and spoke to us about what we'd like from a new head teacher, but that was about it. Still, a big responsibility. What did you say? Miss Sissons asked inquisitively, instantly switching back to the teacher they had known before. I just said not some lunatic who's a liar and a manipulator and is obsessed not with saving the world, but with becoming famous because of it, Yasmin said with a dead straight face. Miss Sissons looked agog. Her mouth fell wide open. You didn't? Of course I didn't. What do you take me for? Yasmin smiled. I'll answer that one, Clara chimed in for the first time with a smile on her face. You be quiet, Yasmin snapped jovially back. The four of them all laughed, but then Sophie went all serious. In a way, it felt like they were all wasting time just sitting around and talking when they could have been doing something more productive. No sign of Katie yet? She asked. Miss Sissons didn't reply. She just shook her head and looked down at the floor. We'll find her, Clara said solemnly. What about King and Houghton? Well, Nathan, Sophie continued with her questions, desperate to get something productive out of the evening. No, nothing. It seems the one thing that Scope is not very good at is finding people who don't want to be found, especially when they don't have an implant, Miss Sisson said. You aren't wrong, Clara said randomly. What do you mean? Sophie asked. Nothing. It doesn't matter. I'd better get back. I promised my dads I wouldn't be long. And with that, Clara said goodbye and zoned back to her house without waiting for a response. As soon as she disappeared, Sophie turned to Miss Sissons and asked, What's wrong with her? I'm not trying to be nosy. I'm just worried about her. Miss Sissons smiled a knowing smile. I know you are, and she knows you are. She just needs more time. She's got something going on that she'll tell you about soon. It's nothing bad. It could be wonderful, but it's a huge thing for her. And don't forget, she spent 6 months in the nightmare programme and never really got time to process it. I swear, nothing bad will come of this. Yasmin and Sophie didn't say anything. They just nodded an understanding nod, assured that their friend was all right and was going to be looked after. So, how's school? Is that supply teacher any better? Miss Sissons asked, changing tact. She's okay. Nothing exciting. A bit boring, Yasmin replied, trying to muster up some enthusiasm. Test preparation going okay? Miss Sissons asked. I got 20 on the spellings today, Yasmin replied enthusiastically. Well done. What did you get, Soph? 19, Sophie said, very slightly disheartened as she knew what would be coming next. Not like you to not get full marks, Soph. What happened? I missed one of the words, Sophie replied, trying to own her mistake. How? Tell me you weren't zoned out? Miss Sissons looked disappointed, like she knew what the answer to the question was. Sophie just nodded and stared past her. Sophie Hardy, the implant is predominantly a hobby, a plaything. You are not to use it in the classroom. I know your parents, and I'm willing to bet they've said the same thing. Sophie nodded, but instead of being upset at what Miss Sissons was saying, she was getting cross. It was only 19. It was only 1 mark. She couldn't be perfect all the time. Have you done your homework? Miss Sissons asked, a bit more animated than she'd been before. Didn't have any, Sophie lied. That's not what Yasmin said, Miss Sisson said, standing up from her chair. You've got a reading comprehension. Have you done it? Yes. Sophie lied again. She knew that a white lie would mean no lecture, and it wasn't like she wasn't going to do it when she got back home. Miss Sissons relaxed slightly, believing the lie. Thank goodness for that. I won't allow this other life that you have to interfere with what's important. That's not why we invited you to this. You are a child first, an agent second. The girls saw how passionate Miss Sissons was about this and how much their childhood meant to her. It was almost like she had a sense of guilt about taking part of the girls' lives away and replacing it with something an adult should be doing, really. But as the three of them knew, it hadn't been her decision. Miss Sissons had often said to them when they were in year 5 they shouldn't waste this part of their lives and that she would love to be 10 again. Aware that she was now lying to Miss Sissons, as she was with her mum, it occurred to Sophie that she was reassuring people by not telling them the truth. If she hadn't lied, they would be all worried and upset with her. Lying had put their minds at rest and was quite good for not just getting her out of a mess, but for also calming people down. Sophie decided that she wasn't normally one for telling lies when adults would believe her when she did. Being a good girl in their eyes meant potentially allowing her to get away with it when she did bend the truth in a way that some other children couldn't get away with. Anything else exciting happen at school? Miss Sissons asked. We're getting a new boy in class. Mrs. Phoenix wants to sit him where Katie sat, Yasmin replied confidently. Really? What's his name? Miss Sissons inquired. Something unusual that starts with a K, Yasmin continued. Well, from that description, he sounds lovely, Miss Sisson said sarcastically. Again, the three of them laughed. Sophie thought, though, back to after school and the woman staring at them from across the road. Yasmin hadn't brought it up, and neither had Clara. So not wanting to look worried or nervous about what was nothing in front of her friends, she didn't tell Miss Sissons about her either. Convincing herself that it would all be fine, Sophie again put the woman to the back of her mind. The little catch-up lasted for about another 20 minutes, at the end of which Sophie again asked if Miss Sissons could open the playground for her to have a quick go, but she flatly refused. As a result, Sophie zoned back into her bedroom and reluctantly did her reading comprehension. A few hours later, Sophie was awoken by the sound of her dad entering the room. It must have been late, as it was pitch black outside, and Sophie found her reading comprehension stuck to her face as she'd fallen asleep at her desk whilst trying to finish it. For a few weeks after the episode at school, lesser-known newspaper and lifestyle websites had offered Sophie's mum and dad lots of money for an interview with her about her experience that day when the implant was put in, but they had both refused without even thinking about it twice. Sophie was not some fad that the world would be interested in 1 minute and completely forgotten about as soon as the next story came along. She was their daughter, and they didn't want her to be treated like that. Money had always been tight in the Hardy house, and now, with both Sophie and Lizzie growing at an alarming rate, needing new clothes with what felt like every week, it was even tighter than normal. So much that Amelia and Tom had been forced to give up one of their internet implant accounts. Tom had cancelled his account, and now he and Mum shared one. It wasn't that inconvenient, it just meant that only one of them could be zoned out at any time. Looking tired, Tom stood behind Sophie at her desk, stroking her head and whispering, "Shouldn't you be in bed?" Still slightly dazed, Sophie replied, I'm going now. Tom laughed. Did you finish that homework? Yes, Miss Sissons told me to, she replied, still a bit confused. You must be tired if you think that Miss Sissons told you to, Tom replied, smiling. It must be all that battling mythicals you do when you zone out. Sophie woke up properly with a start. What do you mean? She asked, with an air of panic in her voice. None of the three girls had told their parents exactly what they got up to on their implants, so her dad asking this threw Sophie slightly. Whatever those online games are that you, Clara and Yasmin play, sometimes I can hear some of the things you say when you're zoned out here on the bed. It sounds exciting. I used to be quite the gamer, you know. Perhaps you'll let me play one day, Tom said. Relieved that her dad had not meant what she thought he meant, but also mortified at the idea of her dad wanting to play computer games with her and her mates, Sophie furrowed her brow and looked at him. He smiled a knowing smile as if Sophie had heard everything he had intended her to hear. Then he carried on as if the conversation had never happened. "Mum is giving me the implant on Saturday afternoon if you want to zone to the football with me," he asked, hoping his daughter would want to at least spend some time with him. Sophie didn't need to think about it. Of course she wanted to spend Saturday afternoon shouting at footballers in the company of her dad. Granted, it was a virtual ticket and not a real one because they were so much cheaper and Sophie could project herself there if she wanted to. But this was Dad, and the chance to spend time with him not doing something that might embarrass her in front of her friends was too much to pass up. She hugged him, and he kissed her head and left. And then Sophie climbed into bed properly. Perhaps training wasn't the be-all and end-all of everything, she thought to herself, and nodded back off to sleep. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by Emma Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a hard copy of the book, then be sure to check out www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.